I never saw it coming. You know, life can be so routine, so predictable, that you start to believe everything's set in stone. My days felt like clockwork. I'd go to work, come home, and we'd go through our daily motions together. It felt safe, secure even. Looking back now, there weren't any obvious warning signs. Nothing about our life together seemed off, at least not to me. I trusted her completely. Isn't that what marriage is built on? Trust. I believed we had that trust, without question. For years, I thought everything was fine. We weren't the type to have big arguments or heated fights. Things just worked. We had our routines, she had hers, I had mine, and it seemed like we were just another couple making it through life side by side. But maybe that was the issue. Everything felt too routine, too predictable. I didn't realize that could be a problem at the time, though. I was focused on work, and she seemed focused on hers. It never crossed my mind that there could be cracks forming in what I thought was a solid foundation. My wife worked as an online German tutor. It seemed like a perfect setup for her. She could work from home, set her own hours, and the flexibility was great. I didn't think much of it. After all, lots of people work from home these days. It felt normal. She was good with languages, so it fit her perfectly. Meanwhile, I had a more traditional job. I worked in an office, dealing with clients face-to-face, managing a team, all the usual stuff. My work wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and I was out of the house most of the day. I'd leave early in the morning and often wouldn't get back until the evening. It never seemed odd to me that she was home all day while I was gone. At the end of the day, we'd talk. She'd tell me about her lessons, how her students were doing, and I'd share what happened at the office. I didn't see any reason to question our setup. It seemed simple, and it worked for us. Looking back now, I wonder if the fact that our lives were so separate during the day was a problem. We didn't spend a lot of time together except at dinner or on the weekends. But at the time, it didn't feel like an issue. It was just life. Everything seemed fine. But then, everything changed. We had this neighbor, an older man named Richard, who lived just a few houses down. He was a real creature of habit, the kind of guy you'd see mowing his lawn every Saturday morning like it was a ritual. Richard had a son, Ben, who was in his early 20s. Ben was quiet, kept to himself mostly. They weren't the type of neighbors you'd see much outside of a passing wave, but one weekend, we decided to host a small barbecue. Nothing fancy, just burgers, beers, and some good conversation. We invited Richard and Ben to join us. It felt neighborly, you know? As we chatted, we got to know them a little better. Ben had this dream of moving to Germany one day. Apparently, it had been his goal for years. He was even trying to learn the language on his own, but wasn't making much progress. Richard, being a bit old-fashioned, asked if my wife could help out with his son's German lessons. He knew she was a tutor, and figured it'd be a good fit. My wife was happy to help, and I didn't think anything of it. Why would I? It seemed like a nice gesture. Richard seemed pleased too, but there was one catch. He didn't like the idea of online tutoring. He was old school, believed in face-to-face learning. So, he asked if Ben could come over for in-person lessons. My wife and I exchanged a look, but we didn't see any harm in it. Sure, we thought. Why not? Ben started coming over a few times a week for his lessons. He'd spend an hour or two with my wife, going over vocabulary, grammar, and all the things you'd expect when learning a new language. I didn't think twice about it. It felt like a simple arrangement, just neighbors helping each other out. Besides, Ben wasn't some stranger. He was just the quiet kid from a few doors down. At first, everything seemed fine. My wife would talk about how Ben was picking up German pretty quickly, how eager he was to learn. She was especially proud of how well he responded to her teaching. Every night after work, she'd tell me about his progress, how he was improving faster than expected. It felt good, hearing her so engaged and happy with her work. But after a week or so, something changed. She stopped talking about Ben. Just like that, the chatter about his progress went silent. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured maybe she was just tired or caught up with other things. It's normal for people to get busy, right? But the shift was noticeable. She had gone from being so animated about his lessons to not mentioning them at all. I figured it wasn't a big deal. Maybe the lessons were becoming routine, Or maybe she was just worn out. I thought about asking her how Ben was doing, but I didn't feel any sense of urgency. I assumed everything was still fine. Why wouldn't it be? Then I got a call from Richard. That's when everything started to unravel. When Richard called, his voice had a certain edge to it, polite but definitely concerned. He said he had been giving Ben some tests to see how much progress he was making in his German lessons, but something wasn't adding up. He told me, "It's strange. Ben was doing great at first, but now it feels like he's stuck. He's not improving anymore." He wasn't accusing anyone, but I could tell he wanted answers. That phone call stuck with me. If Ben wasn't making progress, why hadn't my wife said anything? She used to be so enthusiastic, going on and on about how well Ben was doing. Now, it was radio silence. I told Richard I'd ask her about it, try to see what was going on. He seemed relieved that I'd look into it. After all, he trusted my wife, but as a father, he was understandably worried about his son's future. After hanging up, I sat there for a while, letting my mind run over the details. It was weird that she hadn't mentioned anything about Ben's struggles, especially after being so proud of his early progress. Maybe she was frustrated that he'd hit a wall and didn't want to talk about it. That could happen, right? Not every student keeps improving at the same pace. Maybe she just didn't want to burden me with the details. I figured I'd bring it up casually the next day. But that idea kept nagging at me. The more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Why had she suddenly gone quiet about Ben's lessons? It wasn't like her. I started to get this uncomfortable feeling in the pit of my stomach, but I brushed it off. People have ups and downs with their work, I told myself. Maybe she was just tired of talking about it. Then, one evening, something else happened that made the feeling even worse. I came home from work to an unusually quiet house. No sounds of cooking, no smell of dinner. It wasn't super late, so it struck me as odd. My wife was usually home by then, either finishing up a lesson or just relaxing. I called her, curious to know where she was. She picked up, sounding cheerful, almost too casual. "Oh, I'm just out grabbing a coffee with Ben," she said. "He wanted to thank me for all the help I've been giving him." Something about that felt off. A coffee with Ben? Out of the blue. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the whole thing didn't sit right. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. People get coffee. It's normal. Maybe she was just being friendly, or maybe Ben genuinely wanted to show his appreciation. But the feeling gnawed at me. While I had her on the phone, I brought up what Richard had mentioned. "Hey," Richard said, "Ben's not improving as much lately. He's concerned about the lack of progress. What's going on with that?" Her response was quick. Too quick. "Oh, Richard's just being overprotective. He's micromanaging Ben way too much. Watching him like a hawk, you know? It's probably stressing Ben out. He's doing fine, really." I paused, letting her explanation sink in. It seemed reasonable. Richard was the old-fashioned type, and I could totally see him hovering over his son's education. But something about the way she brushed it off so easily didn't sit right. I expected her to give more details, but she seemed eager to move on from the subject. "Okay," I said, not wanting to press her. She told me she'd be home soon, and I let it go, for the moment. But that uneasy feeling stuck with me, growing louder in the back of my mind. When my wife came home that night, she acted like it was just another ordinary day. She walked in with a relaxed smile, tossed her bag on the table, and started complaining about Richard again, saying he was too overbearing with Ben. "He's driving the poor kid crazy," she said with a sigh. "Constantly checking in, asking him about every little detail. I'm trying to help Ben, but it's like Richard can't see the progress because he's hovering so much." I listened quietly, trying to make sense of it all. She hadn't mentioned anything about Ben in days, and now she was going on about how difficult Richard was being. It didn't sit right with me. Her irritation seemed genuine, but something about the way she kept steering the conversation back to Richard instead of talking about Ben's progress made me feel uneasy. "Ben's doing fine," she said, before going back to venting about Richard's interference. I could tell she was trying to shift the focus away from the real issue, Ben's lack of improvement. It was like she wanted to distract me with her frustrations about Richard instead of addressing what was actually happening with the lessons. I let it go for the moment. I didn't want to push too hard, but something still felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was avoiding something. The next clue came when we sat down to go over our monthly budget, as we always did. We've always kept a close eye on our finances, making sure everything lined up. As we went through her income, I noticed something strange. It hadn't changed. The numbers were exactly the same as always, even though she was tutoring Ben on top of her regular students. I casually brought it up, trying not to sound suspicious. Shouldn't your pay be a little higher this month? With Ben, you've got an extra student now, right? Her response threw me off. She shrugged like it was nothing and said, "Oh, Ben pays in cash. He doesn't transfer it to the bank." I blinked, a little taken aback. It wasn't that paying in cash was unheard of, but it was unusual for her. She usually handled all her payments through bank transfers. I nodded, pretending it didn't bother me. "Makes sense," I said, even though something in the back of my mind told me it didn't. That night, the thought gnawed at me. If Ben was paying in cash, where was the money? I hadn't seen any of it, and it wasn't like we were rolling in extra cash. I decided to do a little digging. The next evening, I gave Richard a call, trying to sound casual. I wasn't accusing anyone of anything, just curious. "Hey, Richard, quick question. How's Ben paying for the lessons? My wife said he's been paying in cash, but I just wanted to make sure everything's all good." Richard's answer raised a red flag I couldn't ignore. He said, "That's strange. Ben's been saving up his money in a jar for his trip to Germany. I haven't noticed him spending much at all. If anything, that jar hasn't gone down lately." His words hit me like a ton of bricks. If Ben wasn't paying her, then what the hell was going on? The cash story was a lie. Suddenly, everything felt wrong. No progress, no payments, and now, this strange excuse about money that didn't exist. I hung up the phone, my mind racing. What were they really doing during those lessons? Why had the talk about Ben's progress stopped so suddenly? And why did she lie about the cash? I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was definitely going on, and I was determined to find out what. That night, I knew I couldn't keep letting these suspicions gnaw at me without doing something. I had to know the truth. So, I came up with a plan to give myself a chance to dig a little deeper without raising her suspicions. The next evening, I suggested a movie night. "Let's just relax and watch a couple of movies," I said, trying to sound casual. I picked a few action flicks I knew she liked, popped some popcorn, and settled in on the couch with her. My mind was racing the whole time, but I made sure to keep the atmosphere light and normal. I wanted her to feel comfortable, to believe everything was fine. Midway through the second movie, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She barely glanced at it, too absorbed in the film to notice. That was my moment. "Hey, your phone's probably low on battery," I said, reaching for it. "Let me plug it in for you." She hesitated for a second, then shrugged. "Sure, thanks," she said, not suspecting anything. I grabbed the phone, pretending to check the battery level before plugging it into the charger. It was a small victory, but it felt huge. The phone was now out of her reach, and I knew I'd have a chance to check it later. After the movie ended, we headed to bed. I played it cool, acting like it was just another normal night. But as soon as she fell asleep, I quietly slipped out of bed and headed back to the living room. Her phone was still sitting there, charging on the coffee table. My heart was pounding as I picked it up, unlocked it, and started scrolling through her messages. At first, everything seemed normal, just the usual texts with friends and students. But then I found a conversation in German. My stomach dropped. It was with Ben. I don't know German, but thanks to translation apps, I quickly started piecing together what the messages said. They weren't just about tutoring anymore. The conversation was filled with flirtatious comments and innuendo, things that made my blood run cold. It was clear they were crossing lines I hadn't imagined. And then I found it. A message from Ben saying he'd bring something special the next day. What the hell was that supposed to mean? I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I tried to comprehend what I was reading. It wasn't just tutoring. They were meeting up outside of lessons, and it was becoming something more. My mind raced as I sat there, phone in hand, feeling like the walls were closing in on me. I had to know more. I couldn't confront her yet, not without more proof. But now, it wasn't just suspicions. I knew something was going on. I needed to catch them in the act. The next day, I left work early. I couldn't wait any longer. I had to see for myself what was really happening. I drove home, heart pounding the whole way, and when I got there, I quietly slipped into the house. I hit record on my phone's camera, hoping I'd be wrong about what I was about to find. But as I stepped into the bedroom, I was met with a sight that made my blood boil. There was Ben, the neighbor's son, right there with my wife. The betrayal hit me like a punch to the gut, and before I knew it, I was shouting, "What the hell are you doing?" The moment I burst into the room, both of them jumped, their eyes wide with shock and guilt. Ben scrambled to pull away from my wife, looking like a deer caught in headlights. My whole body was shaking with rage. I could hardly believe what I was seeing, but there they were, caught in the act. "You think you can come into my home and do this?" I yelled, my voice booming in the small space. "We did you a favor, helping you with your German, and this is how you repay us?" Ben didn't say a word. He just stood there, frozen, trying to gather his clothes, his face pale with fear. I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins as I took a step toward him. "Get the hell out of my house," I shouted, pointing toward the door. "And don't ever come back." Without another word, Ben bolted, rushing past me and out of the house as fast as he could. I watched him go, feeling a strange mix of anger and satisfaction as I saw him run away like the coward he was. Then I turned my attention to my wife. She was sitting there, still in shock, guilt written all over her face. I could hardly breathe. The betrayal was too much. The woman I had trusted with everything had done this, and I couldn't understand why. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "How could you do this to me? To us?" She stammered, trying to find the words, but nothing she said could have made it better. I didn't care what excuses she had. The damage was done, and there was no going back. I stormed out of the room, heading straight for the closet. I grabbed trash bags and started throwing her clothes into them, not caring about what went where. Each item I tossed felt like a small piece of our life together being ripped apart, and honestly, it felt good. It was cathartic. Behind me, I could hear her voice, pleading. "Please, stop. We can talk about this. We can fix it." But I wasn't having it. "Fix it? You think I can just forget what I saw?" I snapped, barely pausing to look at her. "You made your choice. Now you have to live with it." I gathered as much of her stuff as I could and dragged the bags out to the front yard, dumping them on the grass. She followed me, crying and begging me to stop. But I didn't care. I wasn't going to stop. Not after what she did. "You don't get to ask for forgiveness," I said, standing firm as she watched me throw her things out like they were nothing. "You crossed a line, and there's no coming back from that." She stood there, tears streaming down her face, looking completely lost. But my mind was made up. I walked back into the house and slammed the door behind me, leaving her standing in the yard, surrounded by everything she'd just thrown away. It was over. The next day, I called a divorce lawyer. I knew this was it. There was no fixing this, no going back to what we had before. The trust was gone, shattered into a million pieces, and I wasn't about to try to put it back together. The divorce process was long and messy, filled with arguments over money, property, and all the little things that had once made up our life together. She tried to apologize, tried to explain, but I wasn't interested. I had seen the truth, and I couldn't unsee it. As the weeks passed, I started to find a strange sense of peace. Being alone felt better than being with someone I couldn't trust. I threw myself into work, into hobbies I hadn't had time for when I was married. I reconnected with friends and started rebuilding my life, piece by piece. Eventually, the divorce was finalized. I walked out of that courthouse a free man, no longer tied to the lies and betrayal that had weighed me down for so long. It was a bittersweet moment, but mostly, I felt relief. I was free. It wasn't easy, and it took time, but I eventually moved on. I started dating again, cautiously at first, carrying the lessons from my past with me. But with time, I realized that I was capable of finding real, honest connections again. I could rebuild, and I did. In the end, her betrayal was the end of us, but it was also the beginning of something new for me. I had to go through hell to get there, but I came out stronger, knowing exactly what I deserved, and what I'd never accept again. Thank you for visited my YouTube channel. Your support, likes, and comments truly inspire me to create even more engaging content. If you enjoyed this video, Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. You're a part of this amazing community, and I'm thrilled to share my stories with you. See you in the next video on YouTube.